Good afternoon. I'm Dr. George D'Souza. I'm also the Dean of the Medical College and a pulmonologist by training. It's my honor and privilege to welcome you all for this important session on business ethics and ethics in public life. I think recent events have made this a very, very important topic in my mind. Also, we heard in the inaugural, in a world marked by rapid technological advances, economic disparities, and global interdependence, ethics is not just a philosophical ideal, it's an urgent and practical necessity. Ethics in business and public life is no longer a peripheral concern. It stands at the center of academic inquiry and public discourse alike, and it affects all of us. The intersection of business and public life is where some of the most critical decisions affecting millions are made. In both spheres, integrity, transparency, and accountability are not optional virtues but essential foundations for trust and sustainability. Yet we continue to witness breaches that undermine institutions, communities, and the common good. Today's session invites us to reflect deeply: what does ethical leadership look like in boardrooms and public offices? How do we navigate moral dilemmas when personal, professional, and public interests collide? What are the ethical principles that should shape our economic and public institutions that go beyond the individual? We are fortunate to have with us distinguished speakers and thinkers who bring practical thought and experience. I encourage you all to listen closely, engage openly, and then carry forward this conversation into your spheres of influence. I now hand it over the mic to Dr. Maya Mascarenhas, my co-chair, to introduce the speakers.
Thank you, Dr. George. I'm Dr. Maya Mascarenhas, and I'm a pediatrician and a public health specialist by profession. And I'm very happy to introduce the speakers. They're so distinguished that I have to read out a little bit of a bio in case I forget something. Ladies first, we have Dr. Martha Wilcoxson, who's a professor of ethics at the Hasan School of Business in Colorado State, in the University of Pueblo. Her career began in the financial industry as a certified financial planner. During that time, she served as industry arbitrator for the Financial Industry Regulatory Authority, FINRA as it's known as. It was this experience that inspired her to complete the Masters of Negotiated Dispute Resolution from Creighton School of Law and Education Doctorate, and an Education Doctorate from Creighton University, which is in Omaha, Nebraska. Her belief is that quality ethics education in our universities is essential in developing ethical global business leaders. Her research focus is ethical decision-making processes in global businesses. As a board member of the National Association for Community Mediation, she co-chairs the Impact and Values Committee, which is tasked with building a research-based virtual library for mediation practitioner support. She is a 2024 recipient of the College of Professional Studies and Continuing Education Alumni Merit Award and serves on the Dean's Advisory Council. Welcome to this plenary session. And no less distinguished is Mr. T.R. Raghunandan, an advisor to the Accountability Initiative and our consultant in decentralization, anti-corruption, and heritage conservation. Formerly in the Indian Administrative Service, he served as Joint Secretary for the Government of India in the Ministry of Panchayati Raj. That is between 2004 and 2009. And later on as Secretary of Rural Development and Panchayati Raj in the Karnataka state earlier. His current assignments include advisor to Login Asia, a network of practitioners in decentralization from 11 countries in South, Central, and Southeast Asia. This project is supported by the Swiss Cooperation Office in the Embassy of Switzerland. He is also a member of the Local Bodies Commission for Kerala State and a member of the Working Group of Decentralization for the West Bengal government. More recently, he served as consultant with the UNDP office in Timor-Leste, and as a consultant to the World Bank on centrally sponsored scheme reforms, governance advisor with the UNDP's India office, and has been a member of the Committee of Decentralization for the Government of Karnataka. He's also been a member of the State Planning Board, Karnataka, and principal consultant to several expert committees constituted by the Government of India on decentralized public governance. I'm confident we're going to have a very interesting set of speeches from our speakers, and I would request Mr. Raghunandan to start first, because I think he doesn't have a presentation, and then we'll go with Ms. Martha. I encourage you all to listen carefully with curiosity and perhaps take down a few notes for questions or comments later.
Thank you very much for this privilege of addressing you all. The AC has been turned to 18 degrees. It's after lunch. So I suppose I'll have to draw on all my skills to keep you awake. I also do stand-up comedy on governance. If the payment is suitable and appropriate, which unfortunately St. John's did not offer, so I'll have to do with a boring talk at the moment. I haven't come with a presentation on corruption because, as you know, power corrupts and PowerPoint corrupts absolutely. So no presentation. The issue of ethics, accountability and anti-corruption is a very vast subject, and it's a very open-ended subject. Typically, when I'm called as a resource person for this, I negotiate for a half-day presentation with about 60 or 70 slides, which I have sent to you. So if anybody wants to take a look at that presentation, they are welcome to pick it up from Manjulika. I'll only touch on a few points and keep the discussion focused on India and the current situation in India. Now let me ask a question. How many of you think that value systems have deteriorated over the past? Only 2 people. 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Not too many. Well, not bad. There are a lot of people who don't think that value systems have deteriorated, which is very nice. Now, typically, if I ask somebody why do you think that value systems have deteriorated, they will talk about rampant corruption. They talk about the way that wealth is celebrated, the desire is being built in younger people that wealth should be is the sign of success. All this leads to a conclusion that, a very pessimistic conclusion that at least in India, value systems have deteriorated. Now let me ask you another question. When you go into the metro, do you litter? You don't, right? When you come outside, you might just fling a paper packet somewhere, right? You don't spit in the metro, people spit outside, people litter outside. Do you drive in lanes or do you stand in queues in Bangalore? You do. Would you do that in Delhi? If you drive in a lane in Delhi, you will get, hit by from the side. I'm optimistic that in Delhi they will eventually drive in lanes in about 700 years from now, but not as of now. The moment that you go, let's say, to Japan or any other country, I'm just quoting Japan as an example, you immediately conform to many things that we don't do normally as Indians, right? We don't say please, we don't say thank you, right? We generally tend to look down upon a driver or a conductor or somebody who is subordinate to us, right? But that's not the way that you behave when you go outside. So what happened to your value system? Just stepping outside the confines of the metro makes you a different person. And when you are in the metro, you are a different person. Why? How come? So I am very optimistic that actually value systems haven't deteriorated. It's an incentive structure around us that makes us conform to a certain kind of behavior. And we have all the alibis to justify our inappropriate behavior in a certain context. Like I have told drivers, why don't you drive in lanes? Why don't you stop honking? They say, well, you're not going to get anywhere and you're going to endanger your life. Because people are going to hit you from the side. or they will jump in front of you. So it's a survival response, right? Now, if you take and enlarge that principle, and if you look at whether ethics can be grounded in our society, yes, it can. And there are two ways of doing it. One, of course, is that you build a solid grounding of ethics in individuals through ethical education, etc., in which I am not an expert, but there are ways and means by which you are educated in ethics. Now, typically what happens is that we draw our ethical education, at least in India, largely from our religions. Only 2% of India is atheist. Almost everybody else follows in one faith or the other. And our constitution guarantees freedom of faith, Article 26 of the constitution. Now, when you draw your ethics from religion, there's absolutely no doubt, whatever religion you might belong to, you will agree with me if I say that all religions at the core of it have a certain fundamentally the same base. They all say thou shalt not kill, thou shalt be, thou shalt have empathy, thou shalt be unselfish. This is the core of all religions. You should be a good human being, right? And then there's a peripheral bit, the obiter dicta, as it were, about certain food restrictions or certain ritualistic practices and so on and so forth. One problem might be that we overlook and undermine the fundamental ethical base of every religion and begin to imagine that the periphery is the core. So we tend to be much more conscious about observance of the peripheral practices and forget in that haste to be interested in the core of what you are doing. Now, what happens if you are atheist? I happen to be an atheist. What happens if one is atheist? Where does one find one's ethical fundamentals? Well, I have a simple formula. There's an interesting thing which was mentioned to me by a constitutional expert. So he looked at the Constitution of India and said this is a very voluminous document, 300 plus articles. And if you distill it once, you come to what were the 12 fundamental principles which were drafted by the Constituent Assembly as being the guiding framework for the drafting of the nitty-gritty of the Constitution. And then from the 12 fundamental principles, if you do a second distillation, you end up with 5 Gandhian principles, which actually lie at the fundamental root of the Indian Constitution. What are these? Satya, Ahimsa, Swaraj, Sarvodaya, and Antyodaya. Satya, truth. Ahimsa, non-violence. Swaraj is self-esteem, self-rule. It could be interpreted as both self-rule and self-esteem. Sarvodaya is compassion for all, and Antyodaya is compassion for the poorest of the poor, the person completely excluded. Now, that's enough. If you do not believe in a religion, I suppose this is fair enough framework for an ethical grounding, whatever might be your profession, right? But will that alone strengthen you? Will that alone empower you to actually have an influence apart from ensuring that your personal behavior remains unexceptionable? Will you be able to actually influence others to move forward? Yes, if you have that force of personality, but quite often for you to influence other individuals to behave in a certain ethical manner, just as the metro forces you to behave in a certain fashion, you will have to embed your ethical fundamentals into the institution in which you are working. And that is possible. When you have an institution that is built on a fundamental basis of these 5 principles, or it might be even based on principles drawn from the core of religions, you can have institutions that are built on the basis of an ethical framework. And that has happened so many times in India, and I think we should be quite optimistic about it. Why is it that we do not litter in the metro? Have you noticed that in the metro, every train at the terminus is cleaned. In the metro, there's a lady or a man cleaning the station at every half an hour or every 45 minutes. So a clean place creates a culture of, a pride in the possession of the metro. We all believe the metro is ours and it needs to be kept clean. And then we will speak out, we will object if somebody litters in the metro, right? So that is how you build a cycle where a certain kind of appropriate conduct is expected from you in a certain framework. That is possible for you to fit it into an institution. The sad part is that the converse is also true. And sometimes the converse can become the practice simply because the legal frameworks are not incentive enough to create the right atmosphere for an ethical organization. Let me give you an example, and this is an India example. India has actually deteriorated tremendously in terms of our position in the Corruption Perception Index of Transparency International. And sadly, India's response to these are that this is a conspiracy by the West to create a bad name for India, and therefore we should ignore these matters. But the Transparency International has got what is known as a Corruption Perception Index. It is a marking out of 100 marks, and we actually improved our marking at a certain time all the way up to 41 marks out of 100, and now we have dropped down to 38 because of a series of scandals that have happened. Now, one of the reasons, and therefore we are about 90th amongst the countries, we were around the 77th or 76th country, but that really doesn't make much of a difference. It only shows that other countries are improving faster than us and jumping over us in terms of their marking. But in terms of marks, we have come down by about 2 or 3 marks. Now, one of the fundamental reasons why we have slipped in the anti-corruption index is that our corruption laws are very narrow. The Indian Prevention of Corruption Act, and this is a fundamental problem which very few people really understand. The United Nations Convention Against Corruption, which was one of the fastest negotiated treaties in the United Nations in the early part of around 2000-2005, it was ratified. It was actually approved. India took another 5 years to ratify it. The UNCAC says that 12 or 13 kinds of corruption have to be criminalized, and they include concealment of corrupt proceeds, bribery of foreign nationals, private sector corruption, etc. Would you believe it? India has criminalized only 3 of these, and this is in spite of an all-party parliamentary committee deliberating on amendments to the Prevention of Corruption Act about 5-6 years back, and they lost the opportunity to pass it. Private sector corruption, for instance, is not criminalized in India. Bribery of foreign officials is not criminalized in India. Now, this has completely eroded the institutional support structure to make an institution have a strong fundamental ethical base. If you're a private institution today, swimming in a sea where there are competitors, there are sharks trying to swallow you up, and you want to make a profit and show this on your balance sheet and you are accountable to your shareholders. In fact, that is an ethical belief that one must therefore be true to one's shareholders. You have to pay bribes. You have to pay election payments to political parties. If you don't do that, you lose business. You fade out. You can be bought over. So how do you deal with this ethical dilemma? You deal by succumbing to it. And that is a problem that is going to really erode the core of our country's base. This is my opinion. And this is not something that we should overlook, right? Therefore, what is happening is, because in India we only narrowly define corruption as acts committed by public officials, a lot of public sector corruption is not happening at the interface between the public and the government official. It is happening elsewhere. Today in Karnataka, you can go and register your property without paying a bribe. Karnataka has done a magnificent job of putting everything online, right? You can prepare your document for registration of the property, you can file it. All that you need to do is that when the process is complete, you have to go and you have to sign it in front of the sub-registrar. Bingo, that's where you get caught. Because the sub-registrar will vanish. The sub-registrar will be present only if the builder's agent is available, and you do not pay a bribe to the sub-registrar. Never. They wouldn't do something as crude as that any longer. You pay money to the builder's agent. They take it by check. Right? Now you are all in the medical field. I've also sent a paper that we did. I used to run this organization called iPaidAbribe.com. It was a very interesting place where what we did was we crowdsourced reports from citizens. We were not a whistleblowing site. We just crowdsourced reports under 3 categories. I paid a bribe, I didn't pay a bribe, I didn't have to pay a bribe. And after I ran it for about 2 years from inception, and we got a huge number of reports. And it was interesting when we began to analyze the reports to find out the patterns of corruption in different services, different public services. Now what we see is this transformation of the recipient of the bribe not being the government officer but being a private sector agent, because that private sector agent sits in a grey area which is not criminalized. Now you take the medical profession. I've sent a paper which you can circulate. It's just a scoping paper as to how the private sector medical institutions make money. All of you must be knowing about this practice called cut practice. You know what cut practice is? Cut practice is when a general practitioner refers somebody, a patient, to a specialist hospital. He gets a cut, he or she gets a cut. And the cut is given by check. And TDS is deducted, tax at source is deducted. It's that open. And when I asked a few doctors, don't you think this is corruption? Many doctors genuinely believed it wasn't corruption. They were at best willing to admit that it was a sharp business practice, but they did not make the connection in their head that auctioning a patients between 5 or 6 super specialty hospitals is corruption. They didn't see it as that. Now this is the problem. The problem is because of the weak law in India, we are having a lot of corruption that can be arguably positioned or perceived as a sharp business practice rather than as outright corruption. Now similarly, overcharging patients on the basis of their incomes, or prescribing tests and medicines that are unnecessary for a patient, or the other very straightforward bribery is getting payments from pharmaceutical companies to recommend to prescribe their branded medicines as opposed to generic medicines. See, I believe there's a graded system. If you do so much of business for a pharmaceutical company, you can get your private room decorated. If you do something better, then you are taken to Bangkok. If you do really well, then you get taken to Switzerland. There are graded rewards being given, but doctors don't acknowledge this as being corruption. Now how are we going to deal with this? And here from theory, there are two opposing, and I'll end with that, there are two opposing theoretical, shall I say, frameworks that have been clashing in the field of anti-corruption academia. One is the belief that all anti-corruption activity must be based on an ethical foundation. But just merely telling people to be nice people just doesn't seem to work. It doesn't seem to be effective. That alone doesn't seem to be effective. So a counter academic line of thinking, which was actually spearheaded by Professor Robert Klitgar. He did a lot of work on anti-corruption looking at processes, unbundling them, understanding incentive structures as to what builds the process that leads to corruption. And his point was that corruption is an economic offense primarily, and it has to be looked at from the economic lens. It needs to be also dealt with by looking at game theory, etc. One of the very simple formulae that he gave for an anti-corruption strategy was C is equal to M plus D minus A, which is corruption is equal to monopoly plus discretion minus accountability. And actually, you know, if you apply it to many processes, let's say for licensing, for you know, allocation of scarce resources, and so on and so forth, you can find that if you eliminate discretion, or if you demonopolize a sector and give consumers a choice, corruption can get outcompeted in the market. But now there's a very interesting phenomenon happening. In many countries where at least petty corruption on the ground level doesn't exist, the specter of grand corruption has arisen in a very big way. And this is assuming international dimensions. It's very difficult for law enforcement authorities today to track where the bribe money is stashed away. This can happen across countries, and it is actually undermining global finance in a very big way. And there have been scandals in countries that have otherwise been ranked very high in the Transparency International ratings. Such countries have been rocked by scandals in public procurements for airports, for large infrastructure, and so on and so forth. And now there's a counter thinking that comes back to saying that where there are natural monopolies in the government or even in the private sector, you have to come back to ethical education. Now, what will be the pedagogy of that ethical education? It depends on the culture of the people with whom you are dealing with. As I said, in India, it might be not a bad idea to actually use the fundamental core principles within religion, because we are a country that has a deep faith in religion. But in countries which are more agnostic, it might be better to the pedagogical moorings of building an ethical education might be found in the constitution. It might be a better route of going. So this is about all that I can say at this point in time. But just be mindful of the fact that most everything that I have said has got an example or has got some other nuance that is lying in the background, which is there in the longer presentation, which everybody can see. Thank you so much for giving me this opportunity. I look forward to questions if any. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Raghunandan. Very fascinating. And sometimes I wonder, like, you know, whether us doctors need to learn some law also, especially for us. But very interesting that you brought in the connection between, you know, the 5 core principles that follow in India and how we could use those. But we will leave questions and comments for later, and we will now listen to Dr. Martha.
First and foremost, I send a message from my administration at Colorado State University and the Hasan School of Business with their sincere condolences to the people of India for the tragic disaster. So please keep that in your hearts, and you're sincerely in our hearts at the same time. Well, yesterday when I returned home, I repinned, I hope this is okay, I repinned my presentation today because I've been so inspired by this week's presentations. And there's been so many important messages for ethics in education. And I wanted to point out 4 of them that I'm going to take home with me. My intent as an educator and professor of business ethics is to reach those people that are going through education and they're going out into the business world. In my mind, this is how we're going to make business globally better. So there's 4 messages that resonated with me this week, and I'd like to point them out now. I'd like to begin by addressing the important theme of the conference that has highlighted the fact that there's a critical need, and this came through with all presentations. There's a critical need for moral decision-making practices and capabilities. Now, in my classes, we teach decision-making skills. We go through the processes, and we're not necessarily only teaching how to make an ethical decision, but we want students to be able to understand the processes that other people go through so that they can decide with whom they want to do business with and how they do business with other people. So moral decision-making processes and the messages that we've received this week are instrumental in good ethics education, particularly in business schools. Now, if we're going to prepare our graduates, as I said, to go out and be ethical leaders, we've got to develop business education curriculum that's adopted and used by ethics educators. Now, the second message that came through loud and clear is the need for interdisciplinary studies. Business dilemmas, business challenges are complex by nature. And oftentimes I see with my students that come from every discipline. I have students in healthcare, in law, in education. The interdisciplinary conundrum needs to be addressed by business educators. And we do this not simply by building a curriculum, but reaching out to fellow faculty from other disciplines and reaching out to other professions to work with other industries, not just finance. Now, the third message that came through very clearly was that traditionally, and I have to take responsibility in part, traditionally business education in the US has followed a utilitarian theory of ethics, and that's simply the greatest good for the greatest number. But it runs diametrically opposed to virtue ethics, and the utilitarian approach prioritizes the greatest good, but read into that the greatest profit for the most. It focuses on cost-benefit analysis, bottom line analysis, and we have several cases ongoing now in the United States that have been argued ethically in a monetary environment. So students have to be able to be taught to appreciate the negative outcomes of it, the utilitarian approach. And what are the negative outcomes? Well, it's things like having a free ride in environmental damage, in being able to impose business requirements on environmental issues that harm the environment. And we're seeing this now. Going down this road is going to be the road to justifying corruption and practices that will permanently harm the environment for future generations. So if I'm going to be a good ethics educator, I've got to be able to impart this passion to my students, that it's not only business ethics for the current generation, it's for generations in the future. Now, last but not least, but probably more important, is the need to return to virtue ethics, and we've talked about that a lot this week. As educators, we've got to build and we've got to deliver curriculum that emphasizes character, moral integrity, and the cultivation of good habits. If I was going to talk to some of my colleagues in business, this would not sound like familiar territory. But we need to return to Aristotle's message to return to virtue ethics that encourages students to create good habits, to be honest. The importance of having courage, as we just heard, the courage to stand up for what's right, and fairness. And finally, we've got to instill the importance of compassion in our business students. Now, this isn't easy. It isn't easy, but we talked a little bit about situational ethics, and situational ethics, being able to walk the walk, talk the talk, it comes down to having curriculum and educators in the business field that are committed to virtue ethics. Well, this might be a good time for me to share with you a deep concern I have as an American and recent changes in U.S. administrative mandates. There's 4 concerns that I have, and I invite all of you to not only ask questions at the end, but I would be very interested in your comments. But the first concern I have is weakened ethical oversight in U.S. government. Now, for example, the DOJ, or the Department of Justice, they've just greatly reduced funding and the ability and manpower for investigation and termination of those who have corrupt practices, not just in government, but then also in private industry. The focus of the DOJ has been to correct unethical work, but now, with the current administration, and this has just happened since January, since our new administration has gone in, but the focus now is on border control. So there's proper funding for border control. There's a focus for the Department of Justice to protect trade. So we're seeing unreasonable or unjustified tariff provisions. And when my business students see this, and they see it coming from administration, from federal administration, it's very hard to argue that they've got to consider other options. Then the other concern I have, and I'm sorry, and I don't want to make this political, but I think that this ties in so well with business education. The next concern that I have is that the current administration has rolled back environmental regulations. Now, this is huge. They've weakened the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, and it's opened the door which allows or even condones environmental abuse. And they've done this in a very interesting way. First of all, funding has been cut, and then immediately federal positions have been eliminated. So prioritizing profit for over and above environmental protection is another way that my country is not looking out for the benefit of those that will follow. And once again, my duty as an educator is to be able to instill the values in my students that future lives are as important as ours. We've talked quite a bit about the value of dignity, and we need to respect current dignity as well as future. So I'm concerned about our immigration policies, particularly in education. We're undergoing significant changes, reductions in student visas. At my school, we depend a lot on overseas and international study, not just for student numbers, but it's a valuable source of innovation for my university and for the United States. And these visas, we need visa protection. Ultimately, the U.S. is going to experience a brain drain. And I think it's not if it's going to come. We're already starting to see the fallback of numbers of important international students and international faculty as well. What this means for business education is that we have to look once again at the interdisciplinary issues, that business is not just business, it's also social, it's cultural, it's geopolitical. And I need to be able to develop curriculum that's going to impart that information to my students. Well, I'd like to have a quote or give a quote from Dr. Tinhing. And when we talked about dignity, we talked about ethics is when dignity is not recognized. And once again, business ethics education needs to cultivate dignity, respect. Well, all's not lost. Listening to myself, I'm depressed. I don't know if you guys are, but it's kind of an depression. But all is not lost. And Friedrich Nietzsche said, out of life's school of war, that which doesn't kill me will make me stronger. And I really hope that this transformation that my country and my part of the world in business education will come out on the other side and be stronger. Hopefully resilience and commitment to outcomes to these challenges will give us the power to move on. So once again, when it comes to question time, I'd also appreciate your comments. So thank you very much.
The way I looked at it was that ultimately it boils down to ethics being taught and inculcated at a very, very young age. I mean, the way I look at it. Because unless that is done, then I mean, I think that by the time you reach college or you reach university, you reach business school, maybe the game is lost. So, yeah, okay. I mean, that's for this. But yeah, they were very interesting. I mean, but I thought both the talks went on to say that we need to focus on ethics much more than we are doing so. Any questions? Yeah.
Leaders. We find huge resource sits here, but at the global level, we have leaders bereft of ethical and socio-cultural values. Now, be that as it may, the question is one of a Nobel laureate, Rabindranath Tagore, says in Bengali, which means it's Yatra Vishwa Tatra Bhavya Teka Needam, where the whole world is a bird's nest. So it helps every leader to think their country, and it's not in isolation, but it is interconnected with the fabric of others as a global or a Vasudeva Kutumbakam, the global village. But now that thinking being lost, we find that the progress is now, we have taken 2 steps forward but 10 backwards. So the surety with which we are doing our research, surety with which we raise our voices is also being taken for granted, because we may not have the same surety tomorrow. Or when we try to criticize, critically analyze, try to reflect, it might cause a pinch to somebody. And I think Dr. T.R. Raghunandan will realize that it's not just about, when we talk of corruption, even condemning somebody for corruption would also make me guilty of it. So I think a whole idea would be to rethink education along with moral voice, and this should not be subjected or confined to these, but including the political leadership. What kind of ethics do they do? Because in our country, even without education, you can be the topmost person. You don't need even a basic education, as even an attender or the lowest paid person in a hospital needs. So considering that, we need to rethink of a global bioethics, starting with leadership. What kind of leadership do we want people to have? Because solidarity is not only our concept, it's a global concept, but people are not heeding to that. It's only country specific, region specific, like today in Bangalore, people kill each other because you didn't speak Kannada. What is a language anyway? Heart to heart, you can make your expressions clear. So not everybody can have the gift of the gab. So I think we need to relook at that. So this was very eye-opening for me. Thank you so much.
Very nice and insightful presentation, sir. I have a context which I want to first give you. I'm a doctor by profession, and most of my friends, they are also doctors. We practice in a locality which is not very commercially stable. There are a lot of rural people are there. The problem which my friends have told me, and this is a real problem, we are all certified doctors, we are all registered medical practitioners. There's a host of other allied specialities which also do the job in the same area. They are not qualified doctors, and by definition of NMC, they are all quacks. They do the same job, the fraction of the cost, and they do all this specialist referrals which you mentioned, which was very insightful. They do this on a daily basis. Now it becomes a question of survival for us to practice in the same location. And when it's a question between survival and ethics, we all know what you're going to choose. So if this is the situation, can we think of anything which can mitigate this? Perhaps you spoke something about incentivizing the ethical frameworks. Maybe will that be effective in such a situation? That will be my question.
Thank you for that question. The problem about India, and I'm just doing a very broad brush assessment, is that most of our institutions are pretty weak. Whether we talk about the judicial system, 5.7 crore cases pending, 30% of judges post vacant, to an institution like the SEBI. In fact, the last time I made this presentation was in the SEBI on anti-corruption, and I was met with an embarrassed silence, and you know what happened later on. So the point is that all our institutions are extremely weak. Now the question is, this kind of thing should be, the example that you are given, it should be actually, the medical council should come down very hard on it. And we know the kind of scandals that have eroded the credibility of the medical councils, right? Klitgard was once asked, I was quoting again this researcher who's done quite a lot of work, and he says that when you have a situation where it's called hyper-corruption. Hyper-corruption is when corruption is no longer the adventurous act of a few freelancers, but it's actually a networked system with many repercussions, many connections, and so on and so forth. He says, how do countries come out of hyper-corruption? It means repair of institutions. And for repair of institutions, there's only one hope. You have to find miracle human beings who can head an institution and stay the course and change the institution. Do you all remember, many of you are too young to remember this, but I was in service when Mr. Sheshan was the election commissioner. I mean, the way he cracked the whip and the way he changed things. And what happened was that the politicians were so upset with him, but they couldn't do anything about him because he had outmaneuvered the politician by becoming a hero figure in the eyes of the general public. So nobody could touch him. The only thing they did was to undermine him. They changed the election commission from a one-person body to a three-person body. And it so turned out that the other two who came in were people of equally high integrity, Mr. Gill and Mr. Krishnamurthy. And that was it, right? So in India, whenever you reach a stage of despair, you will find one example where somebody goes in a counterintuitive manner and an institution becomes very strong. So, but the answer is that the only way to improve this is better regulation in each one of these fields, which is not happening at present. India has got a long way to go, and the tragedy about India right now is that actually incidence of corruption is probably arguably coming down wherever there is a public interface. You know, many of the public services that were hugely corrupt are becoming much less corrupt. Things like income tax refunds, they just come into your account. Earlier it was a grievously inefficient and corrupt system, now no longer. But that hasn't reduced corruption. All that has happened is that corruption has migrated to the harder to detect and the harder to identify, and even arguably the grey area where some people might not consider it corruption at all. It just becomes a sharp business practice, like what is the example that you have mentioned. And that is going to be very difficult in the future to correct.
From business ethics point of view, what I said earlier, that was how does philanthropy plays at significance in business? And my second question, counter question, I would like to have your insight, sir. Ki if the philanthropy or the philanthropic grant, unfortunately, if they are having corruption at the base, then in government sector, business ethics is not business ethics. It becomes business by ethics, business of ethics, or business for ethics. So maybe I would like to have your both insights.
That's a very important question. And there's philanthropy, and then there's philanthropy. There's self-serving philanthropy, and then there's holistic philanthropy, which increasingly economies all over the world, global economies, are going to increasingly depend upon. But your question is how do we approach each different type?
Yeah, exactly. Means how philanthropy signifies that difference. Means it is always not necessary that philanthropy is a part of business ethics, because philanthropy has different intentions. Exactly. Nowadays we can see that in various types of business.
Yeah. Exactly. And I'll give you two good opposing examples. In the US, there's a family group called the Koch brothers that are very invested in oil and oil research, that are tremendous philanthropists, particularly in education. But they're also funding lobbyists in federal Senate and federal Congress. So their philanthropic intent is not necessarily to support education, but it's to gain support for their own industry. Now on the other side, there's the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, who's done tremendous work in very needy areas without any what we call pork payments from Congress. So the intent, I think, is the answer. You know, to find out the intent and then go from there. But
thank you, Martha. I am an arch conservative when it comes to philanthropy. I would be much more comfortable in a system where companies, corporates, and high net worth individuals pay taxes, and then the taxes are spent for the public good, and we have a very strong scrutiny system to ensure that there is no leakage of public money. I think that is much more proper in a situation like India. Otherwise, what happens is that the public good gets converted into private whimsy. Would you consider wildlife to be a public good? I think it's public good, because for me it is as important for me that an elephant should be conserved in Kerala as a rhino should be conserved in Assam, even though I am at a distance from that rhino, right? Now, would you favor private philanthropy spending huge amount of money to create private zoos? I'm completely against it, because it is completely whimsical. It is based on that one individual. The other problem about CSR funding, which is now mandated under the company law, is that many institutions create their own NGOs. And then the funding goes back to their hands. It just goes from the right hand to the left hand, and they spend the money. The third thing that I see in CSR funding is that people want tangible, displayable results that can be used for advertising. You want somebody to invest in education, they are willing to come and put up an education, a building, and then they can put a label in memory of so and so. Ask them to invest in quality of education outcomes. Very few people are willing to do this. So if I were given a free hand, I would actually crack down on CSR. I would raise corporate taxes, and I would create a very strong scrutiny system to ensure that public expenditure is supervised and made completely transparent. By the way, there are, in all fairness, there are corporates, as Martha says, in India also who have done exactly the opposite. The individuals who have provided the funding have remained in the background. They have put public-spirited individuals, independent, autonomous individuals in the forefront to design and implement their CSR funding, and they have invested in outcomes rather than these tangible things like school buildings and bore wells and so on.
All bureaucrats and politicians and businessmen thought as you did about philanthropy, honestly. I had a question for Dr. Wilcoxson about business ethics, and so you were saying that there's been this big change today, right? In the last maybe 4 months, let's say. I was just wondering about, I don't know if you've seen that documentary, The Corporation.
yes,
Yeah.
that's a staple.
Okay, so I was wondering because it seems to me that in some ways it's built into the system. The profit generation requires some degree of exploitation, requires inequality, and that's sort of business. So ethical. I also want to ask you about that chap Ray Henderson, maybe, who's running the carpets in a sustainable way, Interface or something, and your views on that, if you know what I'm talking about. There's a business that's running tiles and carpets that he's running in a sustainable way, and it sounds really quite amazing. So I'd like to hear your views on.
And this gentleman was phenomenal. He had a carpet producing business, and he was making lots of money, and the corporation was doing well. But he knew that there was a higher calling, and that's the key to this. And so what he did was he spent significant dollars in research in how you recycle carpeting and how you use materials that will be sustainable or recyclable. And when he did this, it was at a tremendous cost to the organization, but it has changed an entire industry, which is a huge industry in the United States. Why did he do it? I think he had that sense of virtue ethics. And that's the type of decision-making processes that we need to be able to teach our students as they go into the business world. The corporation, that would, it's about an hour long, isn't it? It's a video that you can see on YouTube, but it's kind of scary. It's got some good music in it, though. I really like it. There's one song about a bad apple that I can't get out of my head. But the whole idea is, and it's something that you've touched on, is that the less transparency there is in an organization, and that's going to happen the larger the company grows, the less transparency there is unless there are safeguards that are instilled. And this happens through corporate compliance, it happens through legal, it happens through HR, but those transparency processes need to be built into every organization, no matter what the size. Some of my students are going out and being sole owners of an organization, but they need to keep in mind that transparency is one of the ways that we prevent corruption. I hope that. But
Yeah, okay.
that's a good, that's a scary movie. But
Well, maybe that's a message for all of us who haven't seen that movie to go see it. Thank you.
YouTube,
Yeah, just in closing, I think we've got some few very interesting perspectives. Take-home messages, I think, for India is tighten anti-corruption laws, the legal sector to look out for the private business sector and all those gray areas. I think that's one area. Then the need to include virtue ethics in all our curriculums and various interdisciplinary programs that we are all involved in. And hopefully the world will be a better place. It isn't that bad as yet, but it could be better for the next generation. And we always live in hope. And before we actually close, we have a little memento for you, but before we even distribute the memento, I'd like us to stand in for a minute in silence to kind of pay tribute to the people we lost in the air crash yesterday.